Welcome back to Horn Legacies, a series of mini interviews with famous horn players. Today we're speaking with the renowned chamber musician and recording artist, David Jolley. David, it's so nice to get to chat with you today. I know that I have listened to many of your recordings, particularly the one of Le Monde Minuscule really got me through a challenging recital. For those who are listening that might not know who you are or what recordings I might be referencing, could you give us a quick rundown of your French horn career?
Oh, well, thanks very much. And thanks for this opportunity, Kate. Um, yes, my career has been a mixture of chamber music and solo and recording and so on. And all the way through school, I thought I would be in orchestra, right? And so I had my orchestral training and everything. But I had gotten a lot of chamber music when I was a young person in Los Angeles. And so that really bore fruit later on. And I found that I really leaned towards chamber music and also, solo playing. I thought, if I'm working this hard on the horn, I might as well play solos and so on. So, yeah, I made quite a few recordings for the Arabesque label. I guess these days that's not so important. They're just sort of, I don't know, recordings seem to be everywhere these days. But I did a German romantic album and a French album. That's where Le Monde Minuscule is.
It's on
And
the same
Alec
album as
Wilder
Villanelle.
and Villanelle, that's right. And Alec Wilder and so on. And I think, in my first years after school, I was in New York and I bounced around. I did some freelancing. My first year out of school, I like to tell the story that I did 3 Broadway shows in my first year.
How
And luckily
fortunate.
they all closed because, if I'd been sitting in a Broadway pit, I mean, it's
That would have been your
hard.
life.
It's hard work. And the people who do it, I have great respect for them. But boy, was that not for me. And so luckily these 3 different shows just all closed after months and months. And
Might be
after the
the only
third one,
musician who says that sentence.
yeah. And I thought after the third one, I'm just not doing this anymore. I'm going to go home and just practice. I need to practice. So I went home and started playing my Mozart and my scales. That was my project. And what I found over the years, in New York, and I did lots of new music at that point, and I did Orpheus was starting around that point, and also I did things like ballet companies and so on. I would play with those groups. I was doing a lot of things, but what I found was that my own initiatives as a freelancer, my own initiatives were what would set me apart and what would, even though I was running around doing all these freelance things, what I thought of, like what would I like to record, what pieces would I like to get written, what people would I like to collaborate with for chamber music. These were the important things that set me on a slightly different path from other people. So to this day, like when I have a graduating student, I'll tell them, have a chamber group or 2 that you're in, find people that you like to play with. Keep track of the composers that young composers, they can write beautiful music like older composers, and they don't charge as much. So, a friend might write you a great piece. You never know. And also, what was that? That's chamber music and new music. And, well, just keep track of the people that you like to play with. So these things were very important. Oh, also, what if you want to record something, what would you record? Right. So I did a number of recordings, but I did that quite consciously. I do German repertoire, I do French repertoire. That was sort of an excuse to like find pieces that maybe I didn't know yet. But many people, they feel like, well, I'll record when I'm ready, or I have to do this first, or I should.
I have to be
So I would
perfect before
say,
I can.
yeah, that's right. I have to wait for thus and such. I say, don't wait. Don't wait. You're ready, and you'll learn. If you set yourself a recording project, you will learn all the things that you have to do to get that to happen, and that's quite a learning process in itself. And plus, Well, I don't know. It's just so important. Don't wait. Don't wait.
Absolutely. I know that like recording and commissioning new works has been like a capstone of your career. What are some of the favorite projects that you've been able to work on?
Well, I think my favorite project of all time was getting Twilight music by John Harbison written. And that was a fairly early idea that I had. And I never recorded that piece, which is one of my regrets. But I think there are some good recordings of it out there. But that I had always admired John Harbison's music. And I had actually met him. Dorian Quintet was on tour in Rome, and I had met him at the American Society in Rome, and he was there, just a chance meeting. And so that gave me the idea to ask him for a piece. And I was sort of thinking, well, if you're going to ask John Harbison for a piece, what do people need? What does the horn need? And I thought, well, a companion piece for the Brahms trio would be good.
Mm-hmm.
We need that. So I asked him for that, and he said, well, sure, I'll write a horn trio. And so we had set a commission price. And here's where it really gets wonderful, because I had been playing for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center at that point. And I can't remember how it happened, but I was on the phone with Charles Wadsworth one day, and he was asking me about this or that. And somehow, or maybe I just knew I should mention the Harbison to him. And that came up, and he said, "Oh, is that so? You have a
Mm-hmm.
commission from Harbison." And he said, "Well, we could take care of that for you." And I thought,
That's
well,
kind of
how
nice.
wonderful is that? Like, okay, like I don't need to raise that money now. And so that was one of the nicest things that just sort of happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I would offer that as an example of, you have a certain amount of initiative. You go after this or you go after that. And then it can be quite amazing, the things that happen with that initiative. You don't know all the things that are going to happen. But the important thing is that you have some initiative, because for one thing, people see that and they respect it. They respect initiative, and they know that you're doing this, so they're maybe going to ask you to do that. So
And maybe
that's one of
the
my
important part
favorite
in
commissions.
there,
I'm
maybe
sorry.
the important part in there is highlighting not only did you get that commission to happen, but you advocated for yourself. You told other people that you were doing it. You told people it was happening, and because you advocated and advertised for what you were working on, the project, you received other opportunities.
That's right. That's right. And I had been thinking, what shall I do? What's a good project for me to put myself forward? But I had also thought, what would be good for horn players? What do we need for our
Hmm.
repertoire? So it was sort of a shared thing, but I was in there. That's true. A little bit of putting myself forth. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's my favorite story. And I had other commissions that I did, the Ellen Tafe Swillick concerto. That's uh that's a hard concerto.
Hmm.
I I played that
I
about a
admire you
dozen.
for getting that created.
Yeah, I take responsibility for that. But all I can say is it's not as bad as the trumpet concerto, which is just insane. But it's quite I don't know, I would sort of get a headache every time I played that concerto, and after about a dozen times playing it, I must say I was sort of glad not to have to play that anymore. That's a terrible thing to say, but
That's
that's
okay.
another
It just
commission
means
I
it's
did.
time for other French horn players to step up and tackle that piece for you.
Well, absolutely, yes, here, please, take it. But also, I think that's a good example of how, initiatives, you ask this composer for a piece, they give you a great piece. You ask this composer, it's a great piece. It's a great piece, but it's got its problems, and I
Hmm.
find it a difficult piece to play. So not not all the initiatives are all felicitous,
But it's
but
also
that
become a
doesn't matter.
known
You just keep going.
it's also become a known entity in the horn repertoire. Like I know this Willits concerto, plenty of other horn players will know what we're talking about, and even though it might not be a perfect composition, and I also commission a lot of work, so I'm very familiar
Oh,
with you
great.
get it in, you're like, okay, and maybe you talk to the composer a little bit and you make some tweaks, you're like, that's better. But
That's
regardless, like
right.
this process of creating new music is creating new opportunities for learning, new opportunities for performing, not for you, but also for everyone else who will
For
ever play it
everybody.
again.
For everybody. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I know that you are also a bit of a composer and arranger yourself,
Hmm.
and many of your arrangements are available through the Legacy Horn Experiencing publishing company. When and why did you start arranging music?
Well, I think there's sort of two parts to that story. One is that along the way, as a traveling musician, you find yourself sitting in airports, or you're sitting on a bus somewhere, or you're sitting,
In
and
transit.
you have all this, yeah, planes, trains, and automobiles, and you have all this dead time. And it's like, well, I suppose you could practice in an airport. We've all done that. But
Mm-hmm.
sitting on a bus, 6 hours, a day or something, what are you going to do? And so, after you've read, enough mystery novels and, trashy this and that, you've got to do something. So a lot of it had to do with dealing with wasted time, dead
Hmm.
time, Orpheus tours or quintet
Yep.
tours or whatever. And then the other part of that story is that I in the 80s, I was in the Dorian Quintet for about 10 years. And the Dorian Quintet, before I was ever a member of it, because of Jane Taylor, who was an amazing colleague, great bassoonist, great musician, great colleague, and she and the other Dorians before me had the idea to commission great music for the quintet, transcriptions of great music. So they did Beethoven Opus 131. They had Henry Brandt, the composer, do
Mm.
a transcription of that, and also the Goldberg variations. Now, what I thought when I came into the group was, oh, we're going to be playing this music all the time. And then we didn't really play that music all the time. And then I thought, well, they've already played this music all the time. And then it turned out they hadn't played it all the time. And I'm actually still trying to get those. I have to talk to Steve about this. I'm still trying to get these old transcriptions, these wonderful transcriptions, published. It has not been that
Mm-hmm.
easy to just get them published. So we have to have that conversation. But it turned out that the Dorian Quintet, like Jane Taylor told me this story, that the Dorian Quintet had gone to play Opus 131, the holiest of holy ground for the string quartet. They had gone to play it for Robert Mann. And Robert Mann, the first violinist of the Juilliard Quartet for years and years. And Robert Mann, I would say a typical string snob, just said, "Oh, this is terrible. How dare you do this?
Yep.
This doesn't work at all." Well, that's a string player has the prerogative. They can have that point of view. A pianist can also have that point of view,
Mm-hmm.
but we do not have that. We do not have that prerogative. We have to take great music where we find it.
We get what
But
we
he
get.
did, but he did have a suggestion. He said, try some Dvorak,
Mm.
which in his mind, of course, was way down the food chain, like Dvorak, a string quartet, they can barely find time to play Dvorak.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the library. When went to the library in those days, I didn't just look it up online. I went to the library and I started taking out Dvorak quartet scores, what might work for quintet. And I came across, I thought F sharp minor, well, I don't know. A minor, well, I don't know. But then I found Opus 51, which was in E flat, a
Mm.
quartet by
Yep.
Dvorak, number 10 in E flat. And string quartets almost never play it, right? Because what? They've got Bach. They've got Brahms, they've got Schumann, they've got Schubert, they've got Beethoven, they've got Mozart, they've got Haydn, 85 Haydns. They don't need Dvorak, though it's lovely, of course, and sometimes they will play it. But I started to transcribe Opus 51, and that was the biggest thing I ever did, and it took months and months. My daughter was in the cradle at that point, and I remember taking her out for afternoon walks, and while she was sleeping, I'd be working on the transcription. I still have those old sheets of handwritten scores and so on, but it took months and months, and then of course it was factory tested by the Dorians. I would bring in 30 bars and they would play it for me, and of course it was in E flat, and of course it's lovely music, so it sounded great for quintet. So that was how I got started, and then the bug started from there. Then Schubert A minor, which is sort of getting back to holy ground again, mm-hmm. But that worked quite well for quintet. I thought it sounded lovely. And then I did the piano quintet, Opus 81 of Dvorak. I didn't know how the keys would work out for that piece, but that turned out pretty well. And then, transcribing for brass trio, for New York Brass Arts Trio, and just, for different groups, for wind quintet, for brass trio, or for brass ensemble, whatever, it became a real habit for me, and a way to get to know music and to get to know a piece, get inside a piece and really learn it. So I've really been hooked for a long time.
In the interest of time, let's shift gears a little bit. I know that you have a mouthpiece that you've designed with Legacy that is described as designed for the Einsetzen player. And that's a term that maybe a few will recognize from the Farkas book, but maybe a few won't. So could you tell me what that means? And could you tell me about how you designed a rim specifically for what that means?
Okay. Well, first off, I'm going to give a lot of credit to Steve Lewis and whomever he works with, because he's talked about this person, and this person I think is fabulous, because they really did the design. About 5 years ago, I had lost my mouthpiece. I had lost a mouthpiece that I had played for decades. And I was, casting around, what shall I play? And I tried I tried some kind of Schilke. I tried some kind of, I think there's a Somerville mouthpiece that's actually a beautiful mouthpiece, but it didn't work for me. And I think the thing about Einsetzen, Ansetzen means what? Set on the lips. Einsetzen means set in the lower lip, particularly the lower lip. You don't want to be.
It'd be weird to do that on the upper lip.
Yeah, that's right. You don't want to be set into the upper lip, but into the lower lip. Now there are degrees of Einsetzen, right? So what I find is I get in trouble if I get too deeply set in. And somehow in my practicing, sometimes I can end up there, and that's a problem. So I'm going to mention that right now. If somebody wants to know about Einsetzen, there are degrees of Einsetzen. So you sort of want to try and stay right near the where the red of the lip, as we say, meets the normal skin.
It's really great to hear someone
sort of close. I'm sorry?
It's really great to hear someone, especially of your caliber, just openly be like, yeah, this is a problem, and sometimes it creeps up in my playing, and when it comes, I have to go, hey, stop doing that. Because sometimes we idolize, especially great horn players with fantastic resumes that you have, of like, oh, these people are perfect, and they've always been perfect, and they always will be perfect. So I'm really glad that you said that we all have stuff in our playing that we continue to struggle with, continue to work on and develop, regardless of where we're at.
Yes. I think that is so important.
Back to this Einsetzen.
Einsetzen, yeah, that's right. And so for me, and I find that the Einsetzen way of playing, if you play Einsetzen and you're happy, I would say stick with it. It's a perfectly fine way to play, and probably most players play that way. But if you are somewhat set in the lower lip, there's what I call the sweet spot. And you're always trying to find the sweet spot. And when you find that sweet spot, you feel like you can pretty much do anything, and I think that's always been the attraction of Einsetzen, that when somebody really finds that, they, it's a little bit like Archimedes, you've got the leverage to do anything, but sometimes that sweet spot will disappear, whether it's through like the muscles just getting so strong that the way you did it before just isn't there anymore. You have to sort of shift a little bit. So I've done a lot of shifting in my time. And I think a lot of warm up each day is just sort of finding that sweet spot, however your embouchure is behaving that day. Now, maybe some people wouldn't talk that way. Other people would talk that way, which I think is very honest and very good. But I think that's very important. That's what a warm up is, right?
So I'm thinking back to the design of the mouthpiece. Is it designed like for comfort on the lip, or like with a rim thickness that's to help you find that sweet spot?
Well,
what elements were you guys working on?
I think there's a certain curve to the outer rim. That's the important thing, because if you don't have that certain curve, it's difficult for the lower lip to really grip the mouthpiece in the way that it needs to. So it's a matter of getting the grip. So there's sort of a rounded contour to the outside. It's not too sharp, and it's also not too square. Years ago, I played a Lawson mouthpiece, and Lawson was somebody I admired greatly, but the outside contour of the mouthpiece
wasn't built for that.
To be a little square. Yeah, so it ultimately didn't work so well for me. But this outer contour that Steve, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of his designer.
Maybe I believe that he works with the designers at Pickett. Or Pickett Blackbird, for any listeners who are familiar with
they're sensational. Because one day Steve said, "How about this?" And he sent me, about 6 rims and 6 cups, and I thought, "Oh no, I'm in real trouble now, because I'm going to fall in love with this one, and then I'm going to love this one." But luckily, it actually only took about 2 or 3 days, and this one really worked. And then that became, the Jolley rim. But, he said, "How about this? Is this what you're looking for?" And it was, of course, very close to what I had played for years and years. So, was I grateful. Very grateful. And there's a certain width to the face. I think that's very important for, quite a bit of surface for the lips to relate to. When I was in school, and shortly after school, I played a C rim for a while, what people call a cookie cutter. Now, some people really believe in cookie cutters. Not me. I believe in a broader faced rim, and then that curvature on the outside. And I think that's very important for just healthy.
So as we wrap up, I have one more question for you. And this is the tricky one. What is the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
Now, this had me thinking. I was walking around for days with this one, because that is a good one. That's a very good one. Because for one thing, we're getting coached, we're getting taught, we're getting advice, thousands,
Always.
Thousands of pieces of advice. And so I was trying to think of, advice from my great teachers and so on. And of course, they were spectacular, so they were wonderful. But the words of advice that I pass on and that are so important to me, there's really 2 quotes that I came across, because what I do is, like, every time I read a magazine, or every time I'm reading a book, or every time, if I come across something that's interesting, I'll write it down. I have my notebook full of little slips of paper, and I'll write it down, because it's important to remember these things. I used to read the sports pages a lot that way, like football coaches have good advice, or golf pros have good advice. I don't do that so much anymore.
Well,
But
there's such a
anyway,
long line of music pedagogy of taking sports coaches' advice for music playing. I'm thinking of like the inner game of tennis and the John Green
that's right.
books and
Yeah. Zen and the art of archery. Yeah, there we
hmm
go. The inner game of tennis. That's fantastic. Yeah. But anyway, my two quotes that I would say, one is from Einstein, and how can you go wrong with Einstein? Well, actually, there's three quotes I would give, but the Einstein quote is first, where he says, "Imagination is more important than knowledge." So that's Einstein, right? Imagination is more important than knowledge. The second one is from Churchill. And of course, Churchill, he's full of great
hmm
quotes, right? And he said, success is lurching, I think is his word, is lurching from disaster to disaster with enthusiasm. Now, that is a vintage, I mean, if I've got it right, that's like pure Churchill, right? Because he experienced
hmm
a lot of failure and a lot of disaster. And he said, you keep going, right?
Yeah.
But my favorite quote of all is from the German poet Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, right? And he said, and this is my favorite, and my students will know, oh, yeah, he said that to me, is that instruction does much, but encouragement does everything. Now, that is a great quote. And because I think back to all my beloved teachers and the ones that really, taught me, they believe in you and they encourage you. And when I was younger, and some of my older students might say, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I sort of did the pick technique. I would sort of pick at a student, they'd play well and I'd sort of pick at them. It could be better. Pick. And then at a certain point, I realized, I was listening to a particularly great student. I mean, this student just played so well. I mean, I couldn't pick at them. I mean, it just didn't make sense, And I thought, well, I'm just going to tell them how good they
Lift
sound.
them up.
They sound wonderful. You sound wonderful. And I thought, that's sort of a burden on them, or, that was sort of a little bit different from the psychology of the time. The psychology of the time was, don't compliment a student, just tell them what's happening or whatever. But I started complimenting my students, and I noticed that the next week they would sound better. And it doesn't work with every student, of course. Some of them you have to beat on them. But the number that it really did work with, I was amazed. And so from that time, I really changed my style. And it doesn't work with everybody, but that is my favorite quote. And I think that's a pretty good piece of advice.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for your time and all of the wisdom that you've shared with me and all of our listeners today. We've mentioned that you can find your arrangements and your mouthpiece on the Legacy Horn Experience website, but for anyone who wants to find out other information or the things that you're up to or the places that you're teaching, speaking, playing at, where can they find that information?
Well, I don't know. My wife just said, I type in your name and all sorts of junk comes up, so I don't know, but I teach at 4 schools. I teach at Manhattan School, Manus School, Stony Brook, Queens College, 4 schools in New York, still running. And so they probably have some websites, but also just, you just type in the name and a certain amount of stuff will come up. But I want to thank you for this session today, and say hi to Steve for me.
I will.
And I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.